Chain Professionals, or CSCP. And it's really around raising the bar for the supply chain sector to become recognised, Peter. So we all are very aware of, at the executive table where I guess supply chain hasn't previously necessarily had an equal share or a chair at that table, at the executive table. And really it's around lifting the recognition of supply chain as being integral to the whole enterprise and critical that they are at the table. So the work then that I've continued to do in engagement with ASCI led about to another opportunity by default, not by design, Peter. This seems to happen to me a little bit.
I think it happens to us all.
So I was approached by the then CEO of ASCI, who I had this long-term relationship with, and he basically posed the question around whether I would be interested to redevelop, re-energize the New South Wales chapter, as they called them, or state committee. And I asked the question, like I did many years ago, to a recruiter, what does that actually mean? So it was really around getting some people around the table who were passionate in their supply chain careers to volunteer sometime per month, where we could build a committee, and out of a committee then we could build activities where members of ASCI, and members covers both corporates and individual members, where we could look at opportunities of adding value back to the members. So, like all things, they start off slowly and build some momentum, Peter. So over time, I've been able to successfully now build a steady committee of 6. We, behind the scenes, we catch up for an hour on virtual forum like this for an hour or so every fortnight. We have an agenda of discussion points. We look at planning events and activities. And the landscape, if we talk about 2019 versus 2020, Peter, the landscape again has changed. But what's been amazing is how we as a committee, and I guess people adapt so quickly, and we've taken things from what used to be, face-to-face presentations with the support of one of the key sponsors, which was held in the Sydney CBD, to now having virtual or webinar events on a monthly basis. And we have built out a whole series of events over the past 12 months, and we're now planning for 2021 ahead.
So Brendan, I guess to paint the picture a bit more clearly around the connection between APIX and the Australian Supply Chain Institute. Having been through APIX myself, I did my APIX certification some years ago.
Yes.
Maybe you could just unravel a little bit about what APIX is, and
yes.
And the relation to the supply chain world.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a good question. So in terms of simplicity, APIX still exists for all intents and purposes. The programs and courses that APIX have offered, successfully over the years still exist. They've probably been readdressed, rebadged to some degree, just with contemporary education.
And that's an American institution, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's still offered and managed by ASCI. So if you like, ASCI is the umbrella by which people can do their APIX programs, if that kind of makes best sense. So you can...
Maybe an APIX stands for...
No, that's...
It's the... I think it's...
Purchase... It's
American Production and Inventory Control.
Yeah, that's... Yeah.
So it's that professional sort of leg.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they've got various channels. So depending on if people come from a background, there's kind of 3 or 4 different categories that people may undertake
Right.
APICS certifications that you're probably aware of as well, Peter. But you get people who come from purchasing/procurement as one type of area.
Right. Right.
You've got inventory or inventory control being another area. You get planning, across supply demand into the spaces of S&OP, IBP, which is becoming more progressive these days. And then you have warehousing, transport, logistics type of programs. So there's, I think it's ultimately 3 or 4, and I'd have to check against the website at the moment under ASCI, but there's 3 or 4 base programs, certifications that people can take. And it's really the assessment that is typically done is what's the sector space core skills you're using at the present time.
Yeah.
And how will an APIC certification enable you to be more professionally recognized in your area or discipline? And then with people looking at progressive career path or future goals, it's looking at where you see, where you want to head in terms of developing your education platform.
And it's a fantastic qualification, isn't it? I remember when I did it, I was very lucky at the time to work for a progressive organization that felt supply chain was so important and so ill understood, I guess, for want of a better term, that they put all their executives through it, which is not so common. So
Yeah.
I was very lucky and went through the whole process, but I found it just so enlightening and such a practical approach to a professional qualification. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Look, I would agree entirely, Peter, because what we see today, and I think this would be recognized by us all, people come into, let's broadly say, the supply chain sphere from a whole range of disciplines and backgrounds, some loosely qualified or minimal qualification background, right through to people with master's education, sometimes in specialties of supply chain. But and I say this in public address in front of audiences of ASCI members, is where the benefit of ASCI education is that people have a common standard. And this is being mandated by certain organizations globally now, Peter, where they're recognizing that it's fantastic to have people with a broad breadth of education and discipline and backgrounds. The diversity of life is brilliant. Sure. But it's about having a common language that people understand.
Right.
And I won't quote a reference to a particular global pharmaceutical company, but they recognized that being a global business, they had a whole lot of diversity in their supply chain. So the mandate they set at a global level was they would support their supply chain employees, if I use that term loosely, but I suppose the exchange was people needed to get certain minimum qualifications and the company would pay. But they did this 2-3 years ago, they started this journey and it's ongoing. But what they recognized was that because they're working internationally, Peter, and across supply zones and regions globally, that the outcomes have been that people are now speaking the same supply chain language and terminology and reference to the same KPIs, whereas before there was almost like different dialects of supply chain being spoken.
So that's that makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, that's clearly brought a level of professionalism across that supply chain industry that was perhaps missing if you looked at it from a global perspective.
Mm. Yeah, and I, look, I think Australia by and large is probably a slower adopter for some of these things, but without giving too much away, there's been ASCI have had discussions with some large Australian retail companies, and that probably gives a reasonable indication right through to some government entities, right through to some other transport organizations, let's say, who recognize that having a core of base skill and experience is going to be critical in moving forward in terms of benchmarking, but also helping their own people so as that, when the time comes that people may move on, then people have got a recognized qualification and not just 20 years of experience without anything formal to prove that they can take into their next employer.
Yeah, absolutely. So it makes those skills a lot more transferable.
Mm.
Yeah, look, I think it's great development. I mean, I did my qualities quite a long time ago, but it was a great process. I do remember that. So if we come back to ASCI and we talk about the Supply Chain Institute, this must obviously exposes you deeply into the supply chain industry, both in Australia and globally, I would guess. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about the challenges that's faced in the industry at the moment.
Yeah, so I mean, what a time, Peter, to have this discussion. Let's say we were starting to wonder, if we go back to the start of the year, what this whole COVID-19 would really mean. And then by the, mid first quarter, February, March, obviously it was becoming very real to the impacts here locally. What I've seen, probably, I'll answer it from a twofold perspective, one from an ASCI perspective and the other from just recruitment and what's happening and what companies have had to do. I think initially organizations they were starting to implement BCP or risk management frameworks in terms of the what ifs and playing out the scenarios. I think as it became very real of the impacts, and some organizations were feeling this much more quickly than others, depending on the supply chain you were working within or the ecosphere you were working in, then organizations had to take some dramatic restructure steps and unfortunately redundancies in order to protect themselves. Some were playing a bit of a short game to probably determine, was it a case of 3 or 6 months to see how this may play itself out. But ultimately, I think any business in supply chain, I think it's the one thing that unites us all. COVID-19 has been experienced by everyone, man, woman, and child. And as a consequence of that, there's been a massive shift in adaptation or, needing to look at alternatives in terms of how we do things. If we, the fact that we're doing virtual discussion today, if I relate it to ASCI and the impacts on ASCI, we were doing we had our last physical presentation in the Sydney CBD in February. And then there was obviously an understanding that moving forward we would need to change. So we went virtual, and it allowed us to then play to a national audience. Typically Wednesday was a time slot each week, and each chapter then subscribed to supporting weekly webinar. And typically it's been running like that since then successfully, which has been fantastic. But if we go back to organizations and what they've been through, I think what we saw from a recruitment perspective, a lot of potential recruitment that was, being looked at positively was being put on hold. There was restructures starting to be enacted or cost cutting of different types. We're all aware that there was